The dawn came to Blackridge Plantation like a fever breaking, slow, reluctant, and stained with the promise of suffering. Lucinda had risen before the sun, as she always did, her body trained by 23 years of bondage to wake when the darkness still pressed thick against the windows of the slave quarters. The August heat had never truly left during the night, lingering in the Mississippi air like something with weight and breath, and already she could feel sweat gathering at the base of her spine as she made her way across the yard toward the cotton gin building. The Spanish moss hung from the ancient oaks like funeral shrouds, motionless in the breathless morning. In the distance, beyond the fields where cotton stretched toward the horizon in endless rows, the Yazoo River caught the first gray light and held it, dark and sluggish. Lucinda carried a wooden bucket, her bare feet knowing every rut and stone in the path she'd walked 1,000 times before. She was supposed to fetch water from the well before beginning her duties in the main house, but something had been nagging at her since she woke, a wrongness in the air, a silence that felt like held breath. The cicadas should have been screaming by now. They always did, their sound so constant it became a kind of silence itself. But this morning, nothing. Just the whisper of her feet through the dust and the distant call of a crow that sounded almost like laughter. She reached the cotton gin building and stopped. The door stood open, swinging slightly on its hinges though there was no wind. Lucinda set down her bucket, a coldness spreading through her chest despite the heat. She'd been the one to close that door last night, just after sunset, checking all the buildings as she always did. Master Blackridge was away on business in New Orleans, and his wife Marguerite had charged Lucinda with ensuring everything was secure. "Thaddeus," she called out, her voice smaller than she intended. Thaddeus Crane was often the first overseer awake, a wiry man with a face like carved hickory and a disposition to match. "Mr. Crane. Are you there?" No answer. Just that awful silence, and now she could smell something, copper and meat and something else, something sweet and rotten all at once. Lucinda stepped through the doorway. The interior of the cotton gin was dim, filled with the bulking machinery that separated seeds from fiber, the wooden slats and iron teeth casting strange shadows. And there, slumped against the far wall near the gin's main cylinder, was Thaddeus Crane. His head was tilted back at an unnatural angle, and his throat. Lucinda's hand flew to her mouth, stifling the sound that tried to escape. His throat was open from ear to ear, a second mouth grinning beneath his jaw, the wound so deep she could see the pale column of his spine. Blood had soaked the front of his shirt, turning the brown fabric black, and pooled beneath him in a sticky lake that had already begun to attract flies. They buzzed in a thick cloud around his head, crawling across his open eyes, his slack mouth. She stumbled backward, her hip striking the doorframe, pain shooting through her side. Her mind couldn't make sense of what she was seeing. Thaddeus Crane was dead. Murdered. His throat slit like a hog at slaughter. Run. Run to the main house. Wake Mistress Marguerite. Get help. But Lucinda's feet wouldn't move. Because if Thaddeus was dead, killed sometime in the night while everyone slept, then who else? She turned and ran, not toward the main house but toward the stable. Silas Morehouse bunked above the horses, had done so for the past 3 years, ever since he'd arrived from a plantation in Alabama with a reputation for breaking difficult slaves and a fondness for his work that bordered on zealotry. The stable doors were closed, but not latched. Lucinda pulled them open, the hinges shrieking in protest. The horses shifted in their stalls, restless, the whites of their eyes showing. The smell here was worse, manure and hay and fierce sweat from the animals, and beneath it all, that same coppersweet stench. She looked up at the loft where Silas kept his quarters. A hand dangled over the edge, fingers curled like a spider's legs, blood dripping from the fingertips in a slow, methodical rhythm. Drip. 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 Lord have mercy, Lucinda whispered, and this time she did run. But not to the main house. Not yet. Because a terrible certainty was building in her chest, a knowledge that felt like drowning. She ran to the tobacco drying shed, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her vision tunneling. The shed stood at the eastern edge of the plantation grounds, where the cultivated land gave way to wild forest, pine and cypress and oak so old they seemed to predate sin itself. The shed door was open. Of course it was. Abner Quillen lay just inside, sprawled on his back amid the hanging tobacco leaves. His throat bore the same wound, precise and terrible, opening him from one side to the other. His eyes stared at the ceiling, or perhaps at something beyond it, and his hands were clutched at his neck as though he tried to hold himself closed in his final moments. 3. 3 overseers died, their throats slit, their blood spilled on Blackridge soil. Lucinda sank to her knees in the dirt outside the shed, her whole body shaking. The sun was rising in earnest now, painting the sky the color of a bruised peach, and the heat was already building toward the brutal intensity that would make the day a trial of endurance. But she felt cold, so cold her teeth chattered. Who had done this? Which of the enslaved had finally snapped, finally decided that death, their own or their master's, was preferable to one more day in chains? And what would happen when Mistress Marguerite discovered it? What retribution would rain down on all of them for the actions of one? Then another thought struck her, this one sharp as a knife between her ribs. Ezekiel. If this story is gripping you, subscribe to stay updated with more macabre tales from history's darkest corners. Drop a comment below, do you believe in curses? The boy had been strange since his mama Patience was sold away 3 months back, sent to a plantation in Louisiana to settle Master Blackridge's gambling debts. Ezekiel had stopped speaking after that, moving through his days like a shadow, his eyes dark and distant. He was barely 14, small for his age but strong from years of field work, and lately there'd been something about him that made even the other enslaved people uneasy. He moved too quietly. Appeared in places without warning. And sometimes, late at night, Lucinda had heard him talking to someone, or something, though his cabin was empty save for him. Where was Ezekiel? Lucinda pushed herself to her feet, her legs unsteady. She had to know. Had to understand the scope of this catastrophe before she brought it to Mistress Marguerite's attention. Because if all the overseers were dead, if every white man who'd held a whip on Blackridge had been slaughtered in the night. She moved through the plantation grounds in a daze, checking buildings, following that awful smell when it led her. The sun climbed higher. The heat pressed down. And one by one, she found them. Jeremiah Wickham in his cottage, the bedsheets soaked red, his face frozen in an expression of absolute surprise. Caleb Brennan near the main house, sprawled in the kitchen garden among the tomato plants, his blood feeding the soil. Nathaniel Cross by the well, slumped over the stone rim as though he'd been trying to wash away the wound that killed him. Each throat opened with surgical precision. Each killing swift and silent enough that no one had heard screams, no one had raised an alarm. 14 overseers in total employed by Blackridge Plantation, and Lucinda found them all as she traced a widening circle through the grounds. 14 men who had carried whips and brands and chains, who had enforced Master Blackridge's will with violence and cruelty. 14 men died by a single hand in the span of one night, no, not even a night. The blood patterns, the way it had dried in some places and remained wet in others, suggested something impossible. All of this death was delivered in perhaps an hour, maybe less. By the time Lucinda reached the plantation bell mounted on its post near the main house, the sun had fully risen, and the other enslaved people were beginning to emerge from their quarters, confused by the absence of the morning bell that usually summoned them to work. They gathered in small clusters, whispering, sensing the wrongness that hung over Blackridge like smoke. Lucinda looked out across the plantation, at the cotton field stretching toward the river, at the slave quarters with their crude wooden walls and dirt floors, at the grand main house with its columns and galleries, built on the suffering of everyone who lived in those quarters. She looked at the faces of her people, seeing her own fear reflected back at her. Then she reached up and grabbed the bell's rope. The sound split the morning like an axe through wood, urgent, desperate, the alarm that signaled fire or flood or catastrophe. It rang out across Blackridge, across the fields, carrying toward the river and the forest and the town of Vicksburg 15 miles distant. Lucinda pulled the rope again and again, the bell screaming its brass warning, and people began to run. They came from the quarters, from the fields, from the outbuildings. They came and saw the bodies, and their reactions were as varied as their faces, horror, yes, but also something else. A grim satisfaction quickly hidden. A fear that had nothing to do with the dead and everything to do with what would come next. Because everyone knew, when a slave killed a white man, all slaves paid the price. Who did this? Someone shouted. Where's Ezekiel? Another voice called. Has anyone seen Ezekiel? Lucinda kept ringing the bell, her arms burning with the effort, her mind reeling with the impossibility of what she'd witnessed. 14 men. 14 throats slit. 1 hour of blood in the Mississippi darkness. And Ezekiel, small and silent and strange Ezekiel, was nowhere to be found. The cicadas finally began their screaming song, as if they'd been waiting for this moment, waiting for the horror to be revealed in full daylight. The Spanish moss swayed now in a breeze that came from the direction of the river, carrying with it the smell of rotten green growing things and something else, something that might have been honeysuckle or might have been blood. It was impossible to tell anymore. From the main house, a window shattered as Marguerite Blackridge finally emerged, her face white as cotton, her silk nightgown billowing around her. She saw the bodies, saw the gathering crowd, saw the blood soaking into the red Mississippi soil. Her scream joined the cicada's song, and Lucinda knew, with a certainty that felt like prophecy, that this was only the beginning of the horror. That whatever had been unleashed on Blackridge Plantation in that single catastrophic hour would not be satisfied with 14 dead overseers. That some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. The bell rang on, and Lucinda could not make herself stop pulling the rope, even as her palms began to bleed, even as her vision blurred with tears. She rang the bell and wondered where Ezekiel had gone, what had possessed him or broken him or transformed him into something capable of such precise and terrible violence. She rang the bell and knew that Blackridge would never be the same, that perhaps it had never been anything but cursed from its foundation, built as it was on stolen land and broken bodies. The sun climbed higher, indifferent and eternal, and the day's heat settled over the plantation like a shroud. 24 hours earlier, the sun had beaten down on the cotton fields of Blackridge with the merciless intensity of a branding iron. Ezekiel moved between the rows, his fingers bloody from the sharp bowls, his canvas sack growing heavier with each handful of white fiber he picked. The cotton stretched in every direction, an ocean of it, and he was drowning in its waves. His mother had picked cotton in these same fields. Patience, they'd called her, though she'd had precious little of it by the end. 3 months since the wagon had taken her away, 3 months since he'd watched her disappear down the road toward Vicksburg and whatever plantation in Louisiana now claimed her as property. She hadn't cried. I hadn't looked back. Her face had been stone, and Ezekiel understood why. To show emotion was to give the master something else to take from you. He hadn't cried either. Hadn't made a sound. But something inside him had broken that day, snapped clean like a bone under too much pressure, and what grew back in its place was different. Harder. Colder. Move faster, boy. Jeremiah Wickham's voice cut across the field like a whip crack. The overseer sat astride his horse at the end of Ezekiel's row, his face shaded by a wide-brimmed hat, his right hand resting casually on the coiled bullwhip at his hip. You think you're special? Think you can dawdle while others work? Ezekiel didn't respond. Hadn't spoken a word to anyone since his mother left. He just kept picking, his fingers finding the cotton bolls automatically, his mind somewhere else entirely. Somewhere dark and deep, where whispers lived in a language he shouldn't understand but somehow did. The field was full of bent backs and bowed heads, 40 souls picking under the August sun, their shadows short and sharp on the red dirt. Old Moses worked 3 rows over, his movements slow and careful. He had to be near 70, his hair white as the cotton he picked, his hands gnarled with arthritis. But age bought no mercy at Blackridge. If you could stand, you could work. Are you deaf as well as dumb? Wickham had ridden closer, his horse's hooves crushing cotton plants. I asked you a question, boy. Ezekiel met the overseer's eyes for just a moment, long enough to see the cruelty there, the pleasure Wickham took in his power over human lives. Then Ezekiel looked away and picked faster, his fingers flying through the bowls despite the pain. But Wickham wasn't satisfied. He never was. Since Master Blackridge had left for New Orleans 2 weeks ago, the overseers had grown bolder, meaner, as though the master's absence removed some final restraint on their nature. Wickham especially had implemented what he called efficiency measures, impossible quotas, reduced rations, punishments for infractions that hadn't existed before. That's what I thought, Wickham muttered, spurring his horse down the road toward where old Moses worked. Ezekiel's hands stilled in the cotton. A coldness spread through his chest, and the whispers in his head grew louder. Not words exactly, but feelings, urges, a darkness that had been growing since the night his mother left. Well, look at this, Wickham announced, his voice carrying across the field. All work stopped. Everyone knew that tone. Moses, how much did you get in that sack? The old man straightened slowly, painfully, one hand pressed to his lower back. Doing my best, Mr. Wickham, sir. These old hands don't move like they used to, but... Weigh it, Wickham ordered. Thaddeus Crane appeared from the far end of the field, carrying the scale. He was Wickham's shadow, always present for these moments. They weighed Moses's sack, and even from 3 rows away, Ezekiel could see it wasn't enough. Could never be enough. The quota Wickham had set was impossible for a young, healthy man, let alone someone Moses's age. 18 pounds, Crane announced. Quota's 25 by midday. 18 pounds, Wickham repeated, swinging down from his horse. You lazy or just stupid, old man? Moses kept his eyes down. I'm sorry, Mr. Wickham. I'll work faster, I promise, I'll. The bullwhip uncoiled with a sound like a snake's hiss. The first strike caught Moses across the shoulders, and he staggered. The second opened his shirt and the skin beneath. The third brought him to his knees. Please, Moses gasped. Please, sir, I'm trying. But Wickham had found his rhythm now, and the other overseers were gathering to watch. Silas Morehouse. Abner Quillen. Caleb Brennan. They formed a loose circle, some smiling, others impassive, all complicit in what was happening. The whip rose and fell. Rose and fell. Moses stopped begging and just endured, his body jerking with each impact, blood soaking through his shredded shirt. Someone in the field started singing, low and mournful, an old song about crossing rivers and finding rest. Others joined in, their voices creating a shield of sound around Moses's suffering. Ezekiel stood frozen, cotton forgotten in his hands. The whispers in his head had become a roar, rushing like water or wind or something older than either. His vision blurred at the edges, and for a moment he could have sworn he saw shadows moving between the cotton rows, shapes that walked on 2 legs but weren't quite human, faces that were there and then not. The singing grew louder. The whip kept falling. And Moses, old Moses who'd shown Ezekiel how to set snare traps for rabbits, who told stories about Africa though he'd been born in Virginia and never seen the homeland himself, who'd been kind when kindness was a scarce commodity, Moses stopped moving. Mr. Wickham, Crane said quietly. Mr. Wickham, I think. Wickham delivered one final strike, then stepped back, breathing hard, his face flushed with exertion or excitement or both. Moses lay face down in the dirt between the cotton rows, his back a ruin of torn flesh, his blood darkening the red Mississippi soil. Get back to work. Wickham shouted at the field. All of you. Unless you want to join him. The singing died. Slowly, people bent back to their picking, but the rhythm was wrong now, broken. 2 younger men, Isaac and Daniel, moved to Moses's side, checking for breath, for pulse. They looked up and shook their heads. Dead. Moses was dead. Beaten to death for picking 18 pounds instead of 25, for having the audacity to grow old while enslaved. Ezekiel. Wickham barked. You and those 2, take this body out past the property line. Bury it deep. I don't want animals digging it up. Ezekiel moved like a sleepwalker, his body obeying while his mind retreated to that dark place where the whispers lived. He helped Isaac and Daniel lift Moses. The old man was surprisingly light, all bones and used-up muscle, and they carried him away from the field, away from the cotton and the watching overseers and the bent backs of the living. They walked in silence, carrying their burden through the heat. Past the tobacco drying shed. Past the slave quarters. Into the forest where the property line blurred into wild country, where the trees grew thick with Spanish moss and kudzu vines choked everything in reaching green fingers. There was a place here, beyond a stand of ancient cypress trees, where the plantation's dead were buried. Not the white dead, they had a proper cemetery near the church in Vicksburg. This was for slaves, for those whose lives had been used up and discarded. Dozens of graves, maybe hundreds, marked only by stones or wooden crosses that rotted away within a few seasons. They dug in the red clay while the sun climbed higher, taking turns with the 2 shovels they'd brought. The earth was hard, reluctant to receive another body. Ezekiel's hands blistered, bled, but he barely felt it. The whispers had become a constant presence now, and he was starting to understand what they were saying. Enough. Blood for blood. The debt must be paid. When the grave was deep enough, they lowered Moses into it. Isaac said a prayer, his voice cracking. Daniel wept silently. And Ezekiel stood at the edge of the grave, staring down at the old man's ruined back, at the waste of a human life, at the casual cruelty that passed for normal on Blackridge Plantation. Something shifted in the forest around them. The air grew colder despite the heat. The shadows between the trees seemed to deepen, to gather, to watch with ancient attention. "You feel that?" Daniel whispered. Isaac nodded, his eyes wide. "We should go. We should go now." But Ezekiel didn't move. He knelt at the grave's edge and reached down, his fingers digging into the red clay. It was warm, almost hot, and when he brought his hand back up, the clay seemed to pulse with something like a heartbeat. "Enough," the whispers said. "Enough suffering. Enough blood. But more blood is needed. There's. Take what is owed." "Ezekiel?" Isaac's hand on his shoulder. "Ezekiel, come on. We got to get back before they come looking." Ezekiel stood, the clay still clutched in his fist. He looked at Isaac and Daniel, and whatever they saw in his face made them step back. "What's wrong with you?" Daniel asked. But Ezekiel had no words to give them. He'd forgotten how to speak, or perhaps he'd never truly known how. He just turned and walked back toward the plantation, the clay warming in his hand, the whispers guiding him like a current guides a drowning man. That night, long after the sun had set and the slave quarters had fallen into uneasy sleep, Ezekiel sat alone in the cabin he'd once shared with his mother. The clay sat on the floor before him, shaped now into a crude circle with symbols he'd drawn from memory or instinct or something darker. He didn't remember learning these symbols. Didn't know what they meant. But his hands had moved with certainty, carving them into the dirt floor with a rusted nail, marking the boundaries of something that wanted to be born. The whispers were clear now, no longer fragments but complete thoughts flowing into his mind like water finding a crack. "You are the vessel. You are the blade. Tonight, justice will be done." Ezekiel looked down at his hands, small, scarred, still stained with Moses's blood and the red clay from his grave. These hands had picked cotton. Had buried the dead. Had endured. Tonight, they would do something else. Outside, an owl called. The cicadas had fallen silent. And in the darkness beyond his cabin, shadows began to move with purpose, gathering, waiting for midnight when the veil between worlds grew thin and debts could be collected. Ezekiel stood and walked to where a straight razor hung on the wall, his father's once, before his father had been sold south 10 years ago. He took it down, tested the blade against his thumb. Still sharp. Sharp enough. The whispers rose to a crescendo, and Ezekiel finally understood what was being asked of him. What was being demanded? What ancient thing had been awakened by Moses's blood and a 14-year-old boy's breaking heart? He walked out into the Mississippi night, razor in hand, clay dust on his feet, and became something more, or less, than human. The hour of blood was about to begin. Midnight came to Blackridge Plantation like a held breath finally released. Ezekiel stood at the edge of the cotton fields, barefoot in the dirt that had drunk so much suffering over the years. The moon hung low and swollen in the sky, its light turning everything silver and strange. In his right hand, the straight razor caught that moonlight and held it, the blade seeming to glow with its own cold luminescence. He felt empty. Hollow. As though everything that had made him Ezekiel, the boy who'd loved his mother, who'd learned to whistle bird calls, who'd once laughed, had been scooped out and replaced with something else. Something that moved with purpose through the darkness, guided by whispers that were no longer external but had become his own thoughts, his own will. Or perhaps there was no difference anymore. The shadows around him were thick, alive, moving in ways shadows shouldn't move. They coiled at his feet like hunting dogs awaiting a command. And in those shadows, if he looked carefully, he could see faces, Choctaw warriors who'd died defending this land before it became Blackridge, enslaved people who'd perished in these fields, something older still that had slept beneath the red clay for centuries, feeding on anguish until it had grown strong enough to act. "Begin," the darkness said, and it was his own voice speaking. "They sleep. They are vulnerable. Justice will be swift." Ezekiel moved. His first steps took him toward the overseer's cottages that lined the eastern edge of the property, small wooden structures that housed the men who enforced Master Blackridge's will. Jeremiah Wickham's cottage stood nearest, lamplight already extinguished, the windows dark rectangles in the night. The door was unlocked. They never locked their doors. Why would they? Who would dare enter uninvited? Inside, the cottage was sparse, a bed, a table, a chair, Wickham's clothes hanging on pegs. And in the bed, Jeremiah Wickham himself, snoring softly, his bullwhip coiled on the bedside table within easy reach even in sleep. Ezekiel stood beside the bed, looking down at the man who'd killed Moses that very afternoon. In sleep, Wickham's face was almost peaceful, the cruelty smoothed away, making him look younger, almost human. Almost. The razor rose, guided by hands that were Ezekiel's but also not. For a moment, one final moment, some part of the boy he'd been struggling against what was about to happen. Murder. This was murder, no matter how it was justified, no matter what wrongs Wickham had committed. But then he remembered Moses's back, split open like fruit. His mother's face as the wagon carried her away. The endless days of cotton and pain and powerlessness. The razor fell. Wickham's eyes snapped open at the first touch of the blade, but by then it was too late. The razor moved across his throat with surgical precision, opening him from ear to ear in one smooth motion. Blood erupted in a dark fountain, spraying across the white pillowcase, and Wickham's hands flew to his neck, trying to hold himself together, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. His eyes found Ezekiel's in the darkness. Recognition flared there, and something else, disbelief that this small, silent boy could be the instrument of his death. Ezekiel watched until the light left those eyes, until Wickham's hands fell away and the blood stopped pumping and became merely spillage. He felt nothing. No satisfaction, no horror, no remorse. Just emptiness, and the whispers urging him onward. 1, they counted. 13 more. Hurry now. The night is short. He moved to the next cottage. Thaddeus Crane slept on his side, one arm dangling off the bed. The razor found his throat just as efficiently, and Crane died without waking fully, confusion the last expression his face would ever hold. 2. The pattern repeated. Cottage to cottage, blade to throat, death delivered with an efficiency that shouldn't have been possible for a 14-year-old boy. But Ezekiel moved with inhuman speed now, the shadows themselves seeming to carry him from place to place. His feet made no sound. His breathing was silent. He was a ghost, a demon, an instrument of something older than judgment. Silas Morehouse in the stable loft. The horses screamed when they smelled the blood, but by then Ezekiel was already gone, moving toward the next target. 3. Abner Quillen in the tobacco drying shed, where he'd been sleeping off an evening of drinking. He woke at the last second, managed to raise his hands in defense, but the razor was merciless, finding the soft tissue of his throat with practiced ease. 4. Time became strange. Ezekiel existed in a state between seconds, moving through moments that felt stretched and compressed simultaneously. He was everywhere and nowhere, his small form appearing in doorways, beside beds, behind men who turned too late to see their killer's face. Caleb Brennan near the main house, sneaking from the kitchen where he'd been stealing food. The razor opened him silently, and he fell among the tomato plants, his blood watering them. 5. Nathaniel Cross by the well, drawing water for an early start. He saw Ezekiel coming, actually had time to open his mouth to shout, but the shadows wrapped around his throat and strangled the sound before it could emerge. The razor finished what the shadows began. 6. This is only the beginning of the horror. If you're captivated by these dark tales, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments what terrifies you most about this story. Inside the main house, Marguerite Blackridge slept behind locked doors, her children in the nursery upstairs, unaware that death was moving through their property with methodical purpose. But the overseers were the targets, not the family. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. The darkness that guided Ezekiel was precise in its vengeance, focused on those who'd wielded the whips and brands. Benjamin Hart in the carpenter's shop, where he often slept among the wood shavings and tools. The smell of sawdust mixed with copper as his blood spilled across the workbench. 7. Josiah Miller, no, not Josiah Miller. He'd left 2 years ago, had departed suddenly in the middle of the night, claiming he'd seen something wrong with Blackridge, something that had given him nightmares. Ezekiel's blade paused, confused, as the memories sorted themselves. Miller was gone. This was Rufus Dane in Miller's old quarters. Dane died clutching a Bible, his finger marking Psalm 23. Yeah, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. 8. The hours stretched on, each minute pregnant with violence. Ezekiel moved through Blackridge like a nightmare given form, and the razor in his hand never dulled, never hesitated, never missed its mark. His shirt was soaked with blood, not his own, and his bare feet left red prints on the wooden floors, the dirt paths, the cotton gin's planked surface. Chester Williams in the cotton gin building itself, sleeping off his shift. He'd been the one laughing loudest when Moses fell. The razor made sure he'd never laugh again. 9. Marcus Sullivan near the property's southern boundary, in a small shack where he lived alone. They called him the Breaker, because of his specialty, taking slaves who'd attempted escape and ensuring they never tried again. His collection of brands and shackles hung on the wall like trophies. The razor added his blood to the collection. 10. Graham Potter at the blacksmith's forge, where he'd been working late on new chains. The irony wasn't lost on whatever darkness moved through Ezekiel. Potter died with a half-finished shackle in his hands. 11. The shadows were growing thicker now, more substantial, as though each death fed them, strengthened them. They moved around Ezekiel like a cloak, hiding him from casual observation, muffling sound, perhaps even stopping time itself in small pockets where murder could be committed without witness. Lawrence Webb in the overseer's office, asleep at his desk atop ledgers that detailed punishments administered, property damaged, slaves sold. His head lay on those pages as the razor found him, and his blood became ink, rewriting the plantation's history in red. 12. Edmund Hayes near the slave quarters, dangerous territory, this, with so many potential witnesses. But the enslaved people were well trained in seeing nothing, hearing nothing, knowing nothing that might bring trouble down on their heads. And perhaps some part of them sensed what was happening, understood on an instinctual level that tonight was a settling of accounts, and chose to remain in their cabins with doors closed and eyes shut tight. Hayes died silently, his body falling into the shadow of the cabins. 13. One more. Just one more to complete the number, to finish the work that had begun with Moses's death and Ezekiel's breaking heart. The boy, if he could still be called a boy, stood in the center of the yard as the first hints of dawn began to touch the eastern sky. The razor in his hand was slick with blood, his clothes were saturated with it, his face was spattered with it. But his eyes were empty. Hollow. Like windows into a room where no one lived anymore. The final overseer was Samuel Brennan, Caleb's brother, who worked the night watch and should have seen everything, should have raised the alarm, should have stopped this somehow. But the shadows had kept him blind, kept him walking his rounds in a pocket of altered perception where everything seemed normal, where the screaming of horses and the smell of blood never quite reached him. Ezekiel found him near the main gate, just completing his circuit, yawning into the pre-dawn darkness. "Who's there?" Brennan called, his hand moving to the pistol at his belt. But Ezekiel was already moving, already closing the distance with that inhuman speed. The razor rose one final time. Fell one final time. Opened one final throat. 14. Samuel Brennan collapsed at the gate, his blood running down the post, dripping into the dirt of the road that led away from Blackridge toward Vicksburg, toward the wider world, toward escape that would never come. Ezekiel stood over him, the razor finally still in his hand. The whispers that had guided him were quieter now, satisfied, sated. The shadows began to recede as dawn approached, sliding back into corners and crevices, returning to whatever realm they'd emerged from. And slowly, terribly, Ezekiel began to return to himself. The emptiness that had filled him started to crack, and through those cracks came horror. He looked down at his hands, red, dripping, trembling now. His clothes, soaked through. At the body at his feet, and beyond it, the plantation where 13 other bodies lay cooling. What had he done? Or what had been done through him? The razor slipped from his fingers, falling to the dirt with a soft sound. His legs gave out, and he sank to his knees. A sound emerged from his throat, the first sound he'd made in 3 months, since his mother had been taken away, and it was a sob, or a scream, or something that contained both. The sky was lightning. Soon someone would discover what had happened. Soon there would be consequences, for him, for everyone who shared his skin color, for the entire world he'd known. But for this one moment, Ezekiel knelt in the Mississippi dirt and wept for what he'd become, for the 14 lives he'd taken, for Moses and his mother and himself, for every soul trapped in Blackridge's cruel embrace. The cicadas began their morning song, indifferent to human suffering, indifferent to justice or vengeance or the thin line between them. And Ezekiel, empty, hollow, broken beyond repair, stood and walked toward the cotton fields, toward the forest beyond, toward whatever fate awaited a boy who'd become death's instrument for one catastrophic hour. Behind him, the razor lay in the dirt, reflecting the rising sun, waiting to be discovered. The hour of blood was over. The reckoning had just begun. The sun was fully risen by the time Lucinda stopped ringing the bell, her hands raw and bleeding, her arms numb from the effort. The sound still seemed to echo across Blackridge Plantation, as though the brass itself had absorbed the horror and couldn't stop screaming. The yard was filled with people, enslaved men, women, and children emerging from the quarters, their faces showing a complex mixture of emotions that would have been dangerous to name aloud. Fear, certainly. Fear of what would come next, what retribution would rain down on all of them for the actions of one. But there was something else too, something that flickered in eyes quickly lowered, that tugged at the corners of mouths quickly straightened. Relief. Grim satisfaction. The weight of 14 whips suddenly lifted. "Lord have mercy," old Ruth whispered, standing near the body of Caleb Brennan in the kitchen garden. She was the eldest among them, and had been enslaved at Blackridge since before most of the current residents were born. Her eyes were clouded with cataracts, but she saw clearly enough. "Lord have mercy on us all." Isaac and Daniel had returned from burying Moses to find the plantation transformed into an abattoir. They stood together near the slave quarters, speaking in urgent whispers to a growing cluster of men. Lucinda couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could guess. They were deciding what story to tell, how to protect themselves, whether to mention Ezekiel's strange behavior at the gravesite. Because everyone knew by now. The whispers had spread as quickly as the morning light. Ezekiel was gone. Ezekiel had been strange. Ezekiel must have done this. A 14-year-old boy had killed 14 grown men in less than an hour. The impossibility of it sat like a stone in Lucinda's chest, but what else could she believe? The evidence was written in blood across every corner of the plantation. "Get away from the windows." Marguerite Blackridge's voice carried from the main house, shrill with panic. She stood on the second-floor gallery in her nightgown, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, looking like a ghost herself. "All of you, stay where you are. Don't move. The militia is coming." But the enslaved people didn't obey. They moved through the grounds in small groups, looking at the bodies, bearing witness to what had happened. Some wept. Others stood in silence. A few, very few, allowed themselves small, bitter smiles when they thought no one was watching. Marcus's body near the southern boundary. Chester's in the cotton gin. Jeremiah Wickham, who'd killed Moses just yesterday, lying in his own bed with his throat opened wide. They got what was coming, someone muttered. Lucinda didn't see who. The words hung in the air like smoke. "Hush," another voice hissed. "You want us all killed. Hush that talk." Lucinda moved through the chaos, trying to maintain some semblance of order, checking that the children were kept away from the worst of the scenes. Her mind was still reeling, still trying to process the scope of what had happened. 14 men. In 1 hour. By one boy. It shouldn't have been possible. Ezekiel was small, quiet, and had never shown violence before. Yes, he'd changed after his mother was sold, but changed into silence, into withdrawal, not into this. What had happened to him out there by Moses's grave? The sound of hoofbeats interrupted her thoughts. Coming fast up the road from Vicksburg, at least a dozen horses. The militia was arriving. "Everyone back to the quarters," Lucinda called out, her voice hoarse from the bell ringing. "Get inside, stay quiet, don't give them any reason." But it was too late. The riders were already at the gate, already dismounting, already spreading through the plantation grounds with rifles and grim expressions. Most were farmers and shopkeepers from Vicksburg, men who'd been roused from their beds by a frantic messenger and were now confronting a scene from a nightmare. Leading them was Sheriff Thomas Gaines, a thick-necked man with a face like sun-dried leather. Behind him, moving more slowly, was someone Lucinda recognized with a shock of surprise, Josiah Hale. Hale had been an overseer at Blackridge 2 years ago, but he'd left suddenly, in the middle of the night, taking only what he could carry. Rumor said he'd seen something that had driven him away, that he'd woken screaming from nightmares, that he'd claimed Blackridge was cursed. He'd gone back to Vicksburg and opened a dry goods store, and as far as Lucinda knew, he'd never returned to the plantation. Until now. He looked older than she remembered, his face drawn, his eyes haunted. He moved through the grounds with visible reluctance, examining the bodies with an expression that suggested he'd been expecting something like this all along. Sweet Jesus, Sheriff Gaines breathed, staring at Thaddeus Crane's corpse in the stable. All of them? Every overseer? 14, one of the militia men confirmed, emerging from the cotton gin building with a green tinge to his face. Throat slit. Looks like it happened fast, maybe all at once. That's impossible, another man said. One person couldn't. Look at the blood, Josiah Hale interrupted quietly. He was kneeling beside Samuel Brennan's body at the gate, his fingers hovering just above the congealed pool. Some of it's nearly dry, some still tacky, some barely starting to coagulate. Different stages. This wasn't all at once, it was sequential, but fast. Very fast. An hour at most, probably less. Sheriff Gaines turned to Marguerite Blackridge, who'd finally emerged from the main house with a shawl wrapped around her nightgown. Her children peered from an upstairs window, their small faces pale ovals. Mrs. Blackridge, where's your husband? New Orleans. Business. He's been gone for 2 weeks. Her voice was brittle, on the edge of breaking. I sent a messenger this morning. He should be home in 4 days, maybe 5. And the slaves? Gaines gestured at the assembled people. Are any of them acting strange? Is anyone missing besides the boy? Just Ezekiel, Marguerite said. Ezekiel is the only one unaccounted for. He must have done this. He must have, how could he? He's just a child. Children can kill, Gaines said grimly. Especially ones with reasons to hate. Did this boy have a reason, Mrs. Blackridge? A long silence. Everyone knew the answer, but no one wanted to say it aloud. Every enslaved person at Blackridge had reason. Reason measured in scars, in separation from loved ones, in years stolen and dignity denied. His mother was sold 3 months ago, Lucinda found herself saying. All eyes turned to her. To satisfy gambling debts. Ezekiel stopped speaking after that. Wouldn't talk to anyone. And yesterday? Josiah Hale asked, standing and moving toward her. His eyes were kind, or at least less cruel than most white eyes she'd encountered. What happened yesterday? Lucinda hesitated. Isaac and Daniel were watching her, tense, waiting to see what she'd reveal. But lying wouldn't help Ezekiel now, wouldn't help any of them. Moses died yesterday. Old Moses. Mr. Wickham beat him to death in the fields for not picking enough cotton. Ezekiel and 2 others were ordered to bury him. Where? Hale pressed. Out past the property line. In the woods. Where we bury our dead. Hale and the sheriff exchanged a look. Show me, Hale said. They formed a grim procession, Hale, the sheriff, 6 militia men, and Lucinda leading them through the plantation grounds toward the forest. The enslaved people watched them go, and Lucinda could feel their silent prayers following her. Don't tell too much. Don't give them more reason to hurt us. The forest was cooler, shaded by ancient trees draped in Spanish moss. Kudzu vines covered everything, green and relentless, reclaiming the land inch by inch. Birds sang in the branches, indifferent to human concerns, and somewhere in the distance, the Yazoo River murmured its eternal song. They reached the burial ground, and Lucinda pointed to the fresh grave. The dirt was still loose, recently turned. But around the grave, carved into the earth itself, were symbols. Josiah Hale stopped 10 feet away, his face going white. Mother of God. What? Sheriff Gaines demanded. What are those marks? I don't know all of them, Hale said slowly. But I recognize some. That one, he pointed to a spiral carved into the clay, that's Choctaw. A symbol for the underworld, for the place where spirits go. And those, more symbols, geometric and strange, those look like West African spiritual markings. Yoruba, maybe, or Igbo. I saw similar ones on a plantation in Louisiana once, drawn in ash outside slave cabins for protection. Protection from what? One of the militia men asked nervously. From exactly this. Hale gestured at the symbols. These aren't protective, though. These are, invocative. Calling something forth, not keeping something away. And they shouldn't work. They shouldn't be anything more than scratches in dirt. But, the sheriff prompted. But look around you. Feel the air. Something's wrong here. Something's been wrong with Blackridge since the day it was built, and last night, whatever's been sleeping here woke up. That's superstitious nonsense, Gaines said, but his voice lacked conviction. Even he could feel it, the wrongness that hung over this place like humidity, the sense of watching eyes, the shadows that seemed too dark for the amount of light filtering through the trees. Lucinda felt it too. Had felt it for years, if she was honest, but had buried that feeling under the daily necessities of survival. Now it pressed against her skin like fever, like prophecy. The boy did this alone? Gaines was asking. The boy was a vessel, Hale said quietly. I don't think he acted alone. I don't think he could have. No offense to the child, but killing 14 trained men, all armed, all experienced in violence. In under an hour. Moving silently enough that no one heard, saw, or stopped him. He shook his head. Something helped him. Or used him. You're saying what, exactly? That ghosts did this? I'm saying Blackridge Plantation was built on land the Choctaw considered sacred. I'm saying it's been maintained for 30 years through the suffering of enslaved people who brought their own spiritual practices, their own connections to powers we don't understand. I'm saying suffering has a weight, Sheriff. It accumulates. And sometimes, when enough of it gathers in one place, it calls to things that should stay buried. Sheriff Gaines spat into the dirt. I don't care if the devil himself helped that boy. He killed 14 white men, and he'll hang for it. We'll find him. Can't have gone far. But Lucinda, looking at the symbols carved around Moses's grave, at the darkness that seemed to pulse at the edges of the forest, wasn't so sure. Ezekiel had vanished into the woods, into the morning, into whatever fate awaited him. And something told her, something in the whisper of wind through Spanish moss, in the patient watching of the kudzu vines, that they'd never find him. Not because he'd escaped, but because he'd been claimed by something that predated laws and sheriffs and justice as white men understood it. They returned to the plantation to find the bodies being loaded onto wagons for transport to Vicksburg. The enslaved people had been herded into the yard under armed guard, and Lucinda could see the fear written on every face. This was just beginning. The violence would continue, she knew. Not supernatural violence, but the human kind, interrogations, beatings, possibly killings, as the authorities tried to make sense of the senseless and punish those who remained when the guilty party had vanished. Josiah Hale stood apart from the others, his eyes scanning the plantation grounds, the main house, the field stretching toward the river. He was looking for something, or perhaps seeing something others couldn't. You're right, Lucinda said quietly, moving to stand beside him. Something's wrong with this place. Always has been. Some of us could feel it, but what could we do? Where could we go? Hale looked at her, and in his eyes she saw recognition. I left because I started dreaming about them. The Choctaw who died here when the land was taken. The slaves who died in the fields, in the quarters, under the whip. I'd see them standing in the cotton rows at dawn, watching. Waiting. And I knew something was building toward this. I thought leaving would save me from being part of it. He laughed bitterly. But here I am anyway. Will they find him? Ezekiel? No, Hale said simply. Whatever he became last night, whatever used him, it won't let him be found. Not by us. The land will keep him, or the river will, or the darkness that lives beneath Blackridge will. He's beyond human law now. A scream interrupted them. One of the militia men had found something in the main house, symbols carved into the doorframes, the same strange markings that surrounded Moses's grave, fresh cuts in wood that no one remembered seeing before. They weren't there yesterday, Marguerite Blackridge insisted, her voice rising toward hysteria. I would have noticed. They weren't there. But they were there now. Spreading like infection through the plantation, physical proof that something impossible had happened here, that the boundaries between worlds had grown thin, that justice, or vengeance, or ancient hunger, had found a way through. Sheriff Gaines organized search parties, sending men into the woods, along the river, toward Vicksburg and the smaller settlements beyond. But Lucinda could see in Josiah Hale's face that he knew the truth. They were searching for a boy who no longer existed, a child who'd been consumed by something that refused to release its hold. As the day wore on and the heat built toward its brutal peak, Lucinda moved among her people, offering what comfort she could, organizing meals, trying to maintain some semblance of normal routine even though normalcy had died in the night along with 14 overseers. And as she worked, she caught glimpses from the corners of her eyes, shadows moving wrong, shapes that might have been boys standing in the cotton fields, sounds that might have been singing in languages dead for centuries. Blackridge Plantation had changed. The violence of one catastrophic hour had cracked something open, and what poured through that crack would not be easily sealed away again. The reckoning had only just begun. 3 days had passed since the massacre, and Blackridge Plantation had transformed into something between a prison and a haunted house. Armed militia men patrolled the grounds day and night, their faces drawn with exhaustion and growing unease. The enslaved people moved through their tasks under constant surveillance, every gesture scrutinized, every whisper suspected of conspiracy. But Ezekiel remained unfound. The bloodhounds had lost his scent at the edge of the cotton fields, where the cultivated land gave way to forest. They'd circled in confusion, whining, refusing to go farther, as though some invisible barrier prevented them from following. Search parties had combed the woods for miles in every direction, dragged sections of the Yazoo River, questioned farmers and travelers on every road leading away from the plantation. Nothing. The boy had vanished as completely as smoke in the wind. Josiah Hale sat in what had been Jeremiah Wickham's cottage, now converted into a makeshift headquarters for the investigation. The blood had been scrubbed from the floors, but the stain remained, a dark shadow on the wood that no amount of lye soap could erase. He'd been poring over documents for hours, plantation records, maps of the property, the sparse historical accounts of Blackridge's founding. What he was discovering made his blood run cold. Sheriff Gaines entered without knocking, his face haggard. Still nothing. It's like the earth swallowed him whole. The men are starting to talk, Hale. Saying this place is cursed, that we should burn it to the ground and salt the earth. They might not be wrong, Hale muttered, not looking up from the ledger spread before him. What have you found? Hale pushed the book across the table. Look at this. Blackridge Plantation was established in 1812 by Colonel William Blackridge, the current master's father. The land was purchased from the federal government after the Choctaw were relocated. He used his fingers to indicate quotation marks, his voice bitter. But here's what's interesting, the Choctaw didn't sell this land. They fled it. Abandoned it completely 3 years before the colonel arrived. Why? The records don't say explicitly, but I found references in some military dispatches from Fort Adams. Hale pulled out another document, yellowed with age. A Captain Marcus Weatherby wrote that the Choctaw considered this area corrupted ground, that something had happened here, a massacre, maybe, or a mass grave, that made the land taboo. They called it. He squinted at the faded handwriting, the place where shadows feed. Gaines shifted uncomfortably. That's just Indian superstition. Is it? Because 3 months after Colonel Blackridge built the main house, his first overseer, a man named Samuel Cutler, was found dead. Throat slit, just like the 14 we found 3 days ago. They blamed it on Indian attacks, but no Choctaw were anywhere near Mississippi by then. They'd already been forced west. The sheriff leaned against the doorframe, processing this. You're saying this has happened before? Not just once. Look. Hale flipped through the ledger, pointing to entries marked with small crosses. 1815, Samuel Cutler, overseer, throat slit. 1822, Thomas Pritchard, overseer, throat slit, never found the killer. 1829, Marcus Bellamy, overseer, found dead in a cotton gin with his throat cut. And there are others, deaths that are less clear but suspicious. Falls from horses that broke necks. Drownings in the river that made no sense. An average of 1 violent death every 7 years. 7 years, Gaines repeated slowly. 7 years. And 3 days ago marked exactly 7 years since the last suspicious death, an overseer named Edmund Hayes who supposedly fell off a wagon and broke his neck, but the doctor's report noted bruising around his throat consistent with strangulation. Wait. Gaines straightened. Edmund Hayes. I saw that name on the list of bodies we found. Different man. Same name. The current Edmund Hayes was hired to replace the one who died 7 years ago. Hale closed the ledger. The land is feeding, Sheriff. Every 7 years, it takes its due. But this time something changed. Instead of 1 death, we got 14. Instead of isolated incidents spread over time, we got 1 hour of concentrated violence. Because of the boy. Because the boy became a vessel. Because his breaking point coincided with the cycle. Because someone, or something, showed him how to open the door. Hale stood and moved to the window, looking out at the plantation grounds. I need to talk to the older slaves. The ones who've been here longest, who remember things. There's knowledge being kept alive in the quarters, oral histories that might explain what we're dealing with. Mrs. Blackridge won't like it. Mrs. Blackridge is barely holding herself together. Her husband arrives tomorrow, and then this becomes his problem. Until then, I'm trying to understand how to prevent this from happening again. Sheriff Gaines considered this, then nodded. I'll arrange it. But Hale. Be careful. If you're right, if this place really is cursed, then asking too many questions might make you the next victim. Old Ruth sat across from Josiah Hale in the plantation's kitchen house, her gnarled hands wrapped around a cup of chicory coffee. The sun was setting outside, painting the sky the color of old blood, and shadows were growing long across Blackridge. Ruth was nearly 70, had been enslaved here since she was a girl, and her eyes, though clouded with cataracts, saw more than most. Lucinda stood nearby, having vouched for Hale, having told Ruth that he wasn't like the other overseers, that he'd left Blackridge because he'd seen the truth of what it was. You want to know about the darkness, Ruth said. It wasn't a question. Yes, ma'am, Hale replied, surprising both women with his courtesy. Ruth was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. When she spoke, her voice was soft but steady. My grandmother was brought here on the ships. From a place she called Yorubaland, across the water. She was a priestess there, knew the old ways, the old gods. When they chained her, when they brought her to this place, she felt it immediately, the wrongness in the earth. What did she feel? Hungry ground. That's what she called it. Ground that had drunk blood and wanted more. She said the people who lived here before, the ones you call Choctaw, they knew it too. Kept the place sacred but empty, never built here, never farmed here, just came to pay respects to something old and dark that slept beneath. Ruth sipped her coffee. Then the white men came and built their big house right on top of it. Started working the land, started spilling blood, animal blood for food, human blood from the whip. And the thing beneath? It woke me up. Hale felt ice in his spine despite the evening heat. What is it? What's buried here? Don't know. My grandmother had different names for it. Some said it was a demon from the old country. Others said it was something native to this land, older than the Choctaw, older than memory. Maybe it's just the weight of suffering itself, accumulated over centuries until it takes on life. Ruth's milky eyes fixed on Hale with unsettling precision. Does it matter what name you give darkness? It feeds on pain. It grows strong on cruelty. And every 7 years, when the suffering reaches a peak, it reaches up and takes a life. But this time was different. This time, someone opened the door wider. Someone called it deliberately. Ruth set down her cup. Ezekiel. Lucinda stepped forward. Ruth, he was just a boy. A broken boy who performed a ritual at Moses's grave. A ritual my grandmother taught me, that her mother taught her, passed down through generations. We keep the knowledge alive, child, even when we hope never to use it. Because sometimes, when the suffering becomes unbearable, when there's no justice in this world, we need to know there might be justice from another. What kind of ritual? Hale asked. Ruth stood slowly, joints creaking, and moved to the window. Full darkness had fallen now, and fireflies danced in the warm air like earthbound stars. A summoning. A plea for vengeance. You take soil from a fresh grave, soil mixed with the blood of the murdered, and you draw symbols that open pathways between worlds. You offer yourself as a vessel, as a tool for something greater to work through. And if the darkness accepts. She trailed off. It possesses you, Hale finished. Not possession like in your Bible. This is older, stranger. It becomes you and you become it, just for a little while. Long enough to right what's been made wrong, to balance the scales in blood. Ruth turned back to face them. My grandmother warned me that it always comes at a price. The vessel is never the same after. If they survive at all. Do you think Ezekiel survived? Ruth's expression was unreadable. I think the boy who picked cotton and loved his mama is gone. What walked away from Blackridge 3 nights ago wearing his face? That's a different question. Hale stood and began pacing, his mind working through implications. These symbols we found carved into the doorframes, into the foundation of the main house, who made those? We did. Over the years, those of us who knew the old ways. Small marks here and there, protection and warning both. Trying to contain what sleeps beneath, trying to mark boundaries. Ruth smiled without humor. Didn't work so well, did it? Because the suffering was too much. Because the darkness was too hungry. Hale stopped pacing. Ruth, I need to know, can this happen again? Is Blackridge permanently opened, somehow? Will there be more violence? Already has been, Lucinda interjected. You heard about the new overseer? Mr. Jacobson. They found him this morning. Slit his own throat with a straight razor, babbling about debts and payments and a boy standing in the fields. Hale hadn't heard. He felt the room tilt slightly. Jesus. Not Jesus who walks here, Ruth said quietly. This is older territory. The door Ezekiel opened. It doesn't close easily. The darkness tasted freedom, tasted justice, and it's not satisfying. It'll keep reaching up, keep talking, until the source of suffering is ended. You mean until slavery ends? I mean until Blackridge ends. The land itself is corrupted now, and has been since Colonel Blackridge built on taboo ground. You can't just stop whipping people and expect the darkness to go back to sleep. It's woven into the foundation, fed by 30 years of agony. This place needs to be abandoned, torn down, the earth left to follow for generations. Ruth moved back to her chair, suddenly looking at every one of her 70 years. But that won't happen. Master Blackridge will come home tomorrow, will see his overseers dead, and will bring in new ones. The cycle will continue. Until 7 years from now. Or 7 days. The pattern is broken now. All bets are off. Hale stood in silence, processing everything he'd learned. Outside, he could hear the militia men changing watch, their voices low and uneasy. Somewhere in the quarters, someone was singing, a song in a language he didn't recognize, words that might have been Yoruba or Choctaw or something else entirely, something that predated both. The symbols around Moses's grave, he said finally. Could you draw them for me? Ruth shook her head. That knowledge isn't for white folks. Isn't even for most black folks. It's dangerous, Mr. Hale. The kind of danger that eats souls. I'm not trying to use them. I'm trying to understand what we're dealing with. You're dealing with consequences, Ruth said firmly. 30 years of consequences, coming due all at once. And understanding won't save you. Only leaving will. I left once. 2 years ago. I had nightmares about this place for months afterward. Hale moved toward the door, then paused. But you're right. I should leave again. Everyone should. This plantation is a wound that won't heal. After he was gone, Lucinda sat beside Ruth in the gathering darkness. Do you really think the boy is gone? That Ezekiel is lost forever? Ruth was quiet for a long moment. I think part of him is still in there, trapped beneath whatever darkness he summoned. I think he's suffering more than any of us can imagine. And I think. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I think he's not done. The 14 overseers were just the beginning. The darkness showed him how to balance one set of scales, and now it's showing him others. What do you mean? Master Blackridge comes home tomorrow. Brings his cruelty, his whips, his casual violence. You think the darkness will let that stand? You think Ezekiel, or what Ezekiel has become, will let that stand? Ruth reached out and squeezed Lucinda's hand. Storm's coming, child. Bigger than what we've already seen. And when it breaks, we need to be ready to run or hide or pray. Maybe all three. In the distance, toward the cotton fields, a shape moved through the darkness, small, boy-sized, there and then not there. Several of the militia men saw it, raised their rifles, but by the time they reached the spot, nothing remained but footprints in the dirt. Footprints that led nowhere. Footprints that simply stopped, as though their maker had stepped out of the world entirely. And in the main house, Marguerite Blackridge locked her doors and windows, checked on her sleeping children, and tried not to think about the symbols carved into her doorframes. Symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, pulsing with a rhythm like a heartbeat. Like something breathing. Like something waiting. Tomorrow, her husband will return. Tomorrow, he would take control, would impose order, would show these enslaved people what happened when white authority was challenged. Tomorrow, the darkness would be ready for him. But tonight, Blackridge Plantation held its breath, suspended between what had been and what was coming, a wound in the Mississippi earth that refused to heal, that would not heal, that perhaps was never meant to heal at all. The roots of darkness ran deep here. And they were still growing. Master William Blackridge arrived at noon on the 4th day after the massacre, his carriage kicking up red dust on the road from Vicksburg. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and handsome in the way of those who'd never known real hardship, his face tanned from his time in New Orleans conducting business that had likely involved cards, whiskey, and women who weren't his wife. He stepped down from the carriage expecting to find his plantation running smoothly in his absence, expecting the usual bowed heads and quick obedience. Instead, he found armed militia men, terrified slaves, and his wife waiting on the gallery with eyes that had seen too much. "William," Marguerite said, and her voice cracked on his name. "William, they're all dead." He listened to the story, 14 overseers murdered in one night, throats slit, a 14-year-old boy vanished into the darkness. His face darkened with each detail, the color rising in his cheeks until he looked apoplectic. "One boy," he thundered. "You're telling me one undersized slave boy killed 14 grown men, all armed, all experienced in handling difficult property?" "That's what the evidence suggests, Mr. Blackridge," Sheriff Gaines said carefully. He'd been dreading this conversation. "Though there are unusual circumstances. Symbols carved around the plantation, strange occurrences, the complete disappearance of the perpetrator. I don't care about symbols or superstitions. I care that my property has been destroyed, my investment compromised, and apparently no one has been able to find a single child." Blackridge strode through the plantation grounds, examining the places where his overseers had died, his fury building with each sight. "This is unacceptable. Completely unacceptable." Josiah Hale watched from a distance, and something in his chest tightened with foreboding. He'd seen this before, men like Blackridge who believed the world bent to their will because it always had, who couldn't conceive that some forces lay beyond their control. Men who pushed and demanded and never considered that the ground beneath them might give way. "I want every slave on this plantation assembled in the yard," Blackridge ordered. "Now. And I want the truth about what happened here." Within the hour, all 47 enslaved people of Blackridge Plantation stood in rows in the yard, the August sun beating down mercilessly. Children clung to their mothers' skirts. Old men stood with bent backs. Everyone kept their eyes down, knowing what was coming. Blackridge paced before them like a general before troops, his riding crop slapping against his palm. "One of you knows where the boy is. One of you helped him, hid him, and sent him away. And by God, someone will tell me the truth, or all of you will suffer for his crimes." Silence. The kind of silence that had weight, that pressed down like the heat. "Very well." Blackridge nodded to the militia men. "Take that one." He pointed to Isaac, one of the young men who'd helped bury Moses. 20 lashes. "We'll see if that loosens tongues." "Mr. Blackridge," Josiah Hale stepped forward, unable to stay silent. "That man had nothing to do with." "You're dismissed, Hale. This is my property, my decision." Blackridge's eyes were cold. "Unless you'd like to join him." Hale stood his ground for a moment, then slowly stepped back. He caught Lucinda's eye in the crowd, saw the resignation there, the terrible familiarity of this scene. How many times had she witnessed this before? How many times had violence been the master's first and final answer? They tied Isaac to the whipping post, the same post where countless others had been tied before. The whip rose and fell, and Isaac's screams joined the cicadas' song. Blackridge watched with satisfaction, believing he was restoring order, reclaiming authority. He didn't see what Hale saw, the shadows at the edge of the cotton fields growing darker, more substantial. The way the Spanish moss began to sway though there was no wind. The temperature dropped despite the noonday heat. After 10 lashes, Isaac was sobbing, begging, but had nothing to tell because there was nothing to tell. Ezekiel had vanished, and no one knew where. Again. Blackridge shouted. And we'll keep going until. The whip froze in midair. The overseer holding it, a replacement brought in from Vicksburg just yesterday, made a choking sound. His eyes went wide, his face turned purple, and he clawed at his throat as though invisible hands were strangling him. "What's wrong with you?" Blackridge demanded. "Finish the." The man dropped the whip and fell to his knees, still clawing at his throat. Blood began to seep between his fingers. Not from outside, Hale realized with horror, but from inside, as though his throat was tearing itself apart from within. The man collapsed face first in the dirt, blood pooling beneath him, and didn't move again. Silence crashed over the yard like a wave. Every militia man had his rifle up, swinging in all directions, looking for a target. But there was nothing to shoot at, just shadows and heat shimmer and a terrible certainty that something was watching. "There," someone shouted, pointing toward the cotton fields. Hale turned and saw him. Ezekiel, or the thing that wore Ezekiel's shape, standing motionless between the rows. He was exactly as he'd been 4 days ago, small, thin, barefoot, wearing the same blood-stained clothes. But his eyes were different, wrong, holding depths no 14-year-old should possess. "Shoot him!" Blackridge screamed. "Shoot the little bastard!" A dozen rifles fired. The reports echoed across the plantation, birds exploding from the trees in panicked flight. But when the smoke cleared, Ezekiel was gone. Simply gone, as though he'd never been there at all. Or perhaps he'd never truly been there to begin with. "Search the fields." Blackridge was nearly incoherent with rage. "Find him. I want that boy hanging from a tree by sunset." The militia men exchanged uncertain glances but moved toward the cotton fields, rifles ready. Hale watched them go, watched them disappear into the rows, and knew with absolute certainty that some of them wouldn't come back. He was right. An hour later, 3 militia men emerged from the fields, their faces white as cotton, carrying 2 of their companions who'd slit their own throats with their own knives. Both men had been found standing in the middle of the cotton rows, blades in hand, eyes glazed, muttering about debts and darkness and boys who weren't boys anymore. "This is madness," one of the remaining militia men said, his voice shaking. "This whole place is cursed. We should burn it down." "You'll do no such thing." Blackridge shouted, but his authority was crumbling. Even he could feel it now, the wrongness, the watching presence, the sense that Blackridge Plantation had become something other than a place where human rules applied. Josiah Hale found Lucinda near the slave quarters, quietly organizing people, preparing them for whatever came next. "You need to leave," he told her. "Tonight. Take whoever will come with you and run. Head north, hide in the woods, get to free territory somehow. This place is finished." "Where would we go?" "We're property, Mr. Hale. They'd hunt us down, bring us back, make examples of us." But her eyes held hope, desperate and fragile. Unless there's no plantation to bring you back to. Unless Blackridge becomes uninhabitable." Hale pressed a small pouch into her hands. "Money. Not much, but enough to start. Get to Vicksburg tonight, find a man named Jacob Freeman, he'll help. Tell him I sent you." "Why are you helping us?" "Because I should have helped 2 years ago. Because what's happening here is exactly what this place deserved, and the innocent shouldn't pay for the guilty's crimes." He glanced toward the main house, where Blackridge was raging at the remaining militia men. "And because I don't think any of them are going to survive the night." He was right about that too. Darkness fell over Blackridge Plantation for the last time, and with it came a reckoning that had been building for 30 years. Master Blackridge, refusing to abandon his property, had sent most of the militia men back to Vicksburg. Only 5 remained, positioned around the main house with rifles and lanterns, determined to protect the master and his family from whatever supernatural threat they faced. They lasted until midnight. The first man died when his lantern suddenly extinguished, plunging his section of the gallery into darkness. His scream was cut short, replaced by the now familiar sound of blood hitting wood. When the other men reached him, they found his throat opened, his rifle unfired, his eyes staring at something they couldn't see. The second and third died together, both turning their rifles on themselves with mechanical precision, pulling triggers before anyone could stop them. One militiaman managed to gasp out words before he died, "He's in my head." He's showing me everything they did, everyone they hurt, and I can't. The final two fled into the night, running for Vicksburg, abandoning their posts and their pay and any pretense of courage. Inside the main house, Marguerite Blackridge huddled with her children in the master bedroom, furniture pushed against the door, all the lamps burning. She could hear her husband downstairs, loading pistols, cursing, refusing to be driven from his own home by a slave child and superstitious nonsense. "William," she called down the stairs. "William, please, we need to leave." "I'm not going anywhere," his voice echoed back. "This is my land, my house, and no." His words cut off abruptly. Marguerite waited, holding her children close, her heart hammering against her ribs. "William?" No answer. Just the sound of something moving through the house, footsteps too light to be her husband's, too deliberate to be innocent. She heard him then, on the stairs. Slow steps, one at a time, ascending toward the bedroom. And humming, a child's voice humming a tune she didn't recognize, something that sounded like a lullaby and a dirge combined. The footsteps stopped outside the bedroom door. The humming continued. "Ezekiel?" Marguerite whispered. "Ezekiel, please, I had nothing to do with selling your mother. That was my husband's decision, his debts, I tried to stop him." "He's lying in the parlor," said a voice through the door. Not a child's voice anymore, but something older, layered with echoes. "His throat is open. His blood is feeding the floor. One more debt paid. Please. Please don't hurt my children. They're innocent. Innocent." The word was repeated like it was being tasted, examined. "Yes. They are innocent. For now." A pause. "Leave this place. Tomorrow. Take your children and never return. Tell others what happened here. Tell them that Blackridge Plantation is claimed by older powers now, that the ground itself rejects cruelty, that some debts can only be paid in blood." "What are you? Are you still Ezekiel?" Long silence. The humming had stopped. When the voice came again, it was softer, sadder, containing multitudes of pain. "I'm what remains. I'm what the darkness made from a broken boy. I'm justice and vengeance and warning all at once. And I'm so tired." Marguerite heard the footsteps retreat down the stairs, heard the front door open and close. She waited until dawn before she dared to move the furniture from the door, before she went downstairs to find her husband's body in the parlor, throat slit just as the voice had promised. She left that morning, taking her children and whatever possessions fit in the carriage, never looking back at Blackridge Plantation as it receded in the distance. She never returned. No one did. Lucinda and 17 others escaped that night, following Josiah Hale's directions to Vicksburg, to Jacob Freeman, who was part of a network that guided escaped slaves north. Not all of them made it to freedom, some were recaptured, some died along the way, but Lucinda survived. She made it to Ohio, to a small community of free blacks, and lived another 40 years. She never spoke about Blackridge, except once, near the end of her life, when her granddaughter asked about the scars on her back. "There was a place of great evil," Lucinda said slowly. "And there was a boy who became a vessel for something darker. And for one night, justice and horror wore the same face, and I still don't know if what happened was deliverance or damnation or both at once." "What happened to the boy?" "He vanished. Into the woods, into the river, into the darkness that birthed him. Some say he died. Others say he still walks, appearing where suffering is greatest, where the whip falls hardest, delivering his terrible justice." Lucinda touched her granddaughter's face gently. "I hope he found peace. I hope the darkness released him. But I don't think it did." She was right. For years afterward, stories spread through the South of a small figure seen on plantations where overseers were particularly cruel. A boy with empty eyes and a straight razor, appearing in the night, leaving bodies in his wake. Some called him a ghost. Others called him a demon. A few whispered that he was an angel of vengeance sent by a god who'd finally noticed what was being done in his name. The truth, as always, was more complicated. Blackridge Plantation stood empty for 7 years before the bank foreclosed and tried to sell the property. But no one would buy it. The main house decayed, its columns crumbling, its galleries collapsing. The cotton fields grew wild, kudzu consuming everything, erasing the rows where so many had labored and bled. The slave quarters rotted into the earth, returning the stolen wood to the soil. And the land itself seemed to breathe easier, as though a great weight had been lifted, as though 30 years of agony were slowly leaching out, carried away by rain and time and the patient work of growing things. Josiah Hale visited once, 10 years after the massacre. He walked the overgrown paths, stood before the collapsed main house, and felt the difference immediately. The watching presence was gone. The oppressive weight had lifted. The darkness had retreated, satisfied or simply dormant again. But at the edge of the cotton fields, where cultivation met wilderness, he found symbols carved into an oak tree. Fresh symbols, made within the last few months. And beneath them, a small pile of stones arranged in a pattern that looked like a grave marker. Or an altar. Or a promise. Hale never returned to Blackridge after that. The land was eventually purchased by the federal government and designated as public territory, though no town ever grew there, no farm ever prospered. The locals avoided it, spoke of it in whispers, and told their children not to play in those woods. And on certain nights, when the moon was full and the cicadas sang their endless song, travelers on the nearby road reported seeing a small figure standing in what remained of the cotton fields. A boy who watched the road with ancient eyes, who carried something that glinted in the moonlight, who hummed a tune that sounded like a lullaby and a dirge combined. Was it Ezekiel, still bound to the land he'd watered with blood? Was it the darkness itself, wearing his shape, forever marked by the vessel it had used? Was it a warning, a guardian, a reminder that some injustices create wounds that never fully heal? No one knew. No one dared approach close enough to find out. The question remained unanswered, suspended between justice and horror, between deliverance and damnation, between the human capacity for cruelty and the mysterious forces that sometimes, just sometimes, rise up to balance the scales. Blackridge Plantation was gone, but its legacy lingered. In the symbols carved into trees. In the stories whispered across the South. In the knowledge that suffering has weight, that cruelty calls to darkness, and that some debts can only be paid in blood. And in the small figure that still walked those fields on moonlit nights, forever young, forever watching, forever carrying the weight of one catastrophic hour when a broken boy became a vessel for ancient vengeance and changed the shape of a Mississippi plantation forever. Justice or madness? Deliverance or damnation? Freedom or eternal bondage to the darkness that had used him? The answer depended on who you asked, and what they'd survived, and what they believed about the thin places where suffering tears holes in the world and something older than human justice seeps through. Ezekiel, or what remained of him, kept his secrets. The land kept its scars. And Blackridge Plantation stood as a warning, that evil accumulates, that cruelty compounds, and that sometimes, when the weight becomes unbearable, the earth itself rises up to reclaim what was stolen and exact a price measured in blood and darkness and the terrible mathematics of vengeance. The cicadas sang on, indifferent and eternal. The Spanish moss swayed in the Mississippi breeze. And somewhere in the kudzu-choked ruins, shadows moved with purpose, patient and watchful, waiting for the next time suffering reached its breaking point and called out for justice, or something that wore justice's face in the darkness. Thank you for reading this macabre journey into darkness. If this story haunted you, subscribe for more horror from history's shadows, and comment with your thoughts. Was this justice or something far more sinister?